The brook itself keeps up a steady, low murmur that never stops. Its water is cold and clear, running over rounded stones where patches of cress grow in thick green clumps. The sound of it is not loud enough to be called rushing. It is more like a quiet conversation that the water has been having with the earth for centuries, never hurried and never interrupted. Along its banks, willow branches droop motionless, their leaves already thinning for the season, and each one is wrapped in its own tiny halo of mist. A single duck paddles slowly against the current, makes no sound, and disappears under the wooden footbridge that connects the lane to the meadow path. For a long while, the only sign of life is the occasional drip of water from the thatch eaves onto the flagstones below, a soft tap that comes at uneven intervals and reminds you that the world is still breathing. A rooster calls somewhere near the baker's cottage far down the lane, but the sound is muffled by the damp air, stretched thin and distant until it is less a crow and more a low, rolling murmur that blends into the mist and fades away. The baker himself has already been up for half an hour. You cannot see his cottage clearly from here, but you know that one lantern burns in his window, a tiny orange fleck in all the grey, and you can just make out the thin line of smoke that rises from his chimney, thick and white against the mist before it curls away into nothing. He is stirring his coals and setting his dough to rise, and that small domestic warmth is the only beacon in the entire sleeping village. All the other windows are dark. The families inside are still wrapped in wool blankets, their breath slow and even, their dreams still holding them beneath the surface of the morning. You turn your attention to the smithy, which stands a little apart from the other buildings, where the lane widens into a packed dirt yard. It is a sturdy structure of stone and timber, with a steep roof and a wide door made of heavy oak planks that is now shut and barred from the outside with a wooden latch. The great door faces the lane, but it is not welcoming at this hour. It keeps its secrets inside. Next to the smithy is the Wheelwright's workshop, a long, open-fronted shed with a roof that slants lower and a floor of beaten earth. Under that roof, a heavy oak wagon wheel leans against the stone wall, and even in the dim light, you can see that its iron tire is worn thin in places, ready to be replaced. The wheel has travelled many miles over rutted roads, and its felloes are dark with age and old grease, but the spokes are still straight and true. It waits there, patient as stone, while the mist settles on its surface in tiny beads of moisture. You can trace the shape of it with your eyes slowly, from the iron hub in the center out along each spoke to the curved outer rim, and the longer you look, the more you feel the weight of its stillness. The smithy door does not creak open yet. The forge inside is cold. Nothing but a bed of grey ash from the previous day's work, and the anvil sits on its oak block like a dark shape half hidden in shadow. A pair of long tongs hangs from a peg on the wall, their jaws stained with old soot. The bellows, made of stiff leather and wood, are collapsed and silent. A thin film of dust covers the handle of the cross-peen hammer that rests on the workbench, and the water in the barrel by the door is perfectly still, with not a ripple to disturb its surface. Even the scents are muted. The tang of old charcoal, the faint sweetness of pine resin from the woodpile, the earthy smell of damp stone. All of these things are asleep, waiting for the wheelwright to come and set the day in motion. Master Thomas, the wheelwright, is not yet walking down the lane. He is still in his own cottage, a small dwelling with a low ceiling and a hearth that is just now flickering back to life. He has finished a cup of warm broth, sipped slowly while sitting on a wooden stool by the fire. The broth was made from yesterday's vegetables and a bit of salted mutton, and the warmth of it has spread through his chest and into his hands. He is in no hurry. He knows that the iron and the wood will wait for him, as they have always waited, and that nothing good comes from rushing a task that requires fire and time. So he buttons his thick leather apron with slow, deliberate movements, tugs his wool cap down over his ears, and stands for a moment, looking out the small window at the mist that shrouds his garden. A robin perched on the fence post outside ruffles its feathers against the damp, but does not sing. Thomas's wife stirs in the next room, and he speaks a few quiet words to her about the day ahead, his voice low and unhurried. Then he steps out the door, drawing it gently close behind him, and the cool air meets his cheeks with a softness that is almost kind. The path from his cottage to the smithy is no more than a few hundred paces, but Thomas walks it as if distance is something to be savoured. His boots make a soft, steady crunch on the gravel and packed mud, a sound that accompanies rather than disturbs the silence. He passes the well in the centre of the village, where the bucket hangs motionless on its rope, and he passes the ancient elm tree whose leaves have turned yellow and brown, some of them scattered on the ground in a wet carpet. The mist is just beginning to thin along the tops of the hedgerows, revealing the red berries of the hawthorn and the last of the blackberries, shriveled and sweet. A farm cart sits idle by the side of the lane, its shafts resting on the ground, a puddle of water collected in the hollow of its bed. Thomas glances at the cart's wheels as he always does, checking the iron tires out of habit. They are seated well, no gaps between iron and wood, a job he did 2 winters ago that still holds firm. He touches the rim with his knuckle, just briefly, and the iron is cold and wet with dew. When he reaches the smithy yard, the sky has shifted from charcoal to a softer pearl grey, and the mist is beginning its slow retreat into the brook bed from which it rose. The outlines of the workchef are clearer now, and the shape of the waiting wheel is more defined, its iron tire showing the dull sheen of rust in the growing light. Thomas stops for a moment in the centre of the yard, listening. The brook still steady, the rooster quiet now. A wood pigeon coos from the elm tree, its call repeating 5 times before it fades. The air smells of wet straw and turned earth, of wood smoke from the baker's chimney, of the coming day. It is the kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones, a quiet that asks nothing of you but to be still and let it be. Inside the wheelwright's workshop, the dimness is still deep. Thomas does not light a lantern yet. He knows the space so well that his hands can find the tools without his eyes. He moves to the wheel, running his palm along the rim, feeling the places where the old tire is worn smooth from countless turns on the road. The wood underneath is sound, but you can feel with your fingers the slight looseness where the iron has stretched over time, a fraction of an inch that grows with each passing season. That looseness will be gone by the end of the day. He pats the hub, as one might pat the flank of a horse, a gesture of familiarity, and then he turns to the forge. The cold bed of ash waits for the crackle of tinder and the breath of the bellows. The heavy iron tire that will be forged today lies in straight bar form along the wall. A dark, rough length of metal that holds no heat yet, but will soon glow orange and then shrink with a grip that no force can undo. Everything is in its place. You might linger a while longer in the yard, watching the mist thin above the brook, until you can see the water itself, dark and clear, flowing over the stones with a gentle, endless patience. The duck has returned, paddling upstream with small, silent strokes. A wren flits from the thatch of the smithy roof to the woodpile, and then vanishes. The yellow light from the baker's window is still burning, though it seems paler now, and the smell of baking bread begins to drift down the lane, mingling with the mist and the wood smoke. Church bell notes do not ring yet. The clock will not strike for another hour. The village holds its peace. Thomas looks up at the sky, his face calm and unreadable. He sees that the mist will lift completely within the hour, giving way to a pale autumn sun that will warm the stones of the yard just enough to dry the dew. He runs his thumb along the edge of the chisel in his apron pocket, feeling its sharpness, and nods once to himself. Then he props the smithy door open with a flat stone, letting the morning air drift inside to meet the cold forge. The iron and the wood are ready, and the day will bring the hiss of steam and the rhythm of sledgehammers. But for now, there is only the quiet mist, the sound of the brook, and the slow turn of the world toward light. Once the mist has risen enough to show the full shape of the smithy standing against the pale sky, Master Thomas steps across the threshold of the workshop and into the cool, dark interior. The open door lets in a slant of grey light that falls across the packed earth floor and touches the edge of the cold forge without warming it. Thomas moves without hurry to the center of the room, where he stops and lets his eyes adjust to the dimness. He can smell the old charcoal dust and the faint, metallic tang of iron scale that has been ground into the floor over many years of work. The rafters above are dark with soot, and a single cobweb stretches from the crossbeam to the wall, catching the new light like a strand of silver thread. Everything is as he left it the evening before, quiet and waiting. He walks over to the bellows and places his hand on the wooden top board, feeling the grain of the oak that has been worn smooth by countless hours of use. The leather sides of the bellows are stiff from the cold, and he works them gently with one hand, pumping the top board up and down a few times to loosen the folds and let the leather remember its shape. A faint puff of air stirs the ashes in the forge, just enough to send a tiny grey plume into the air before it settles back down onto the cold coals. The sound of the bellows is a soft, rhythmic whoosh, like the breathing of a large animal that has been asleep through the night and is now slowly stirring. His apprentice, Ned, arrives without any announcement. You might not notice him at first because he steps through the open door with the same quietness that marks everything in the village. He is a young man of 17, with broad shoulders and hands that are already rough from 2 years of working with iron and wood. He wears a heavy canvas apron over his wool shirt, and his hair is damp from the mist. Ned does not speak. He simply meets Thomas's eye with a slight nod, a gesture that means he is ready for the day, and then he moves to the far wall where the long tongs and the sledgehammers hang from their pegs. There is an understanding between them that words are saved for the moments when they are truly needed, and a morning opening is not one of those moments. Ned lifts down the 2 heavy sledgehammers, one in each hand, feeling their weight and balance before leaning them carefully against the stone wall near the forge, their iron heads resting on the floor and their long ash handles pointing up toward the rafters. The handles are polished from long use, dark in places where sweat and friction have worked into the grain. Next, he takes the long tongs from their peg, 2 pairs of them, each one 4 feet long with curved jaws that can grip a hot iron tire without slipping. He lays these across a wooden sawhorse where they will be easy to reach when the time comes. His movements are slow and deliberate, not because the work is difficult, but because he has learned from Thomas that a tool placed well is a tool that will not fail you in the middle of a hard job. There is a certain rhythm to the preparation, a quiet sequence that unfolds step by step without any rush or hesitation. Thomas, meanwhile, has knelt down beside the forge and is raking out the old ashes with a flat iron scraper. The ashes are fine and grey, still holding the faint shapes of the lumps of charcoal that burned away yesterday. He draws them out in a low mound on the hearthstone, then uses a small shovel to transfer them to a bucket that will be carried out later and spread on the garden where they will sweeten the soil. The fire bricks at the base of the forge are dark red and cracked in places, but they still hold their shape well enough, and he smooths the remaining dust with the flat of his hand before reaching for the woodpile. There is something calming in this simple work, the clearing away of what is spent so that what is new can take its place. From the woodpile stacked against the outer wall of the smithy, Thomas selects several logs of seasoned hardwood, pieces that have been cut from a great oak felled 2 winters past and split into manageable lengths. He carries them inside one by one and arranges them in the base of the forge, laying them close together, but not tight, leaving small gaps where the air from the bellows can find its way through. On top of these logs, he places a generous handful of dry birch twigs and a few scraps of old cloth smeared with a little tallow, the tinder that will catch the first spark and grow into the fire that will heat the iron tire to a glowing orange. He takes his time with this arrangement, because a fire laid poorly will not burn evenly, and an uneven fire can ruin a long day's work before it has even properly begun. His hands, thick and scarred from countless small burns over the years, place each twig with the same care a cook might use when seasoning a pot. Ned has moved to the water barrel that stands just inside the door, where he lifts the wooden lid and peers inside. The water is clean and cold, filled fresh from the well the evening before, and a single leaf that must have blown in during the night floats on the surface. He plucks it out and lets it fall to the floor, then fills a smaller bucket that will be used for quenching the hot iron later in the day. The dipper hangs from its hook, and he fills it too, taking a long drink before setting it back. The water runs cool down his throat, and he wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. Outside, the brook continues its endless murmur, a sound so constant that you forget it is there until you pause and listen for it again. The measuring stick, which is little more than a straight length of ash wood marked with fine lines cut by a knife edge, hangs from a nail near the door. Thomas takes it down and sets it on the workbench, along with a strip of soft cord that has been used to measure the circumference of many wheels over the years. The cord is dark with handling, its fibers worn smooth, but it still has enough give to wrap snugly around a filler band and give a true measurement. He places it beside the measuring stick, and then turns his attention to the heavy chisel that lies in the tray of tools. He tests its edge against his thumb, finds it sharp enough, and returns it to its place. The arrangement of tools on the bench is like a small ritual, each item set where it can be found without looking, each one known by its weight and its feel. The big oak wagon wheel still leans against the wall of the workshop, visible through the open door. Its old iron tire, which was removed the day before, lies on the ground beside it, a dark ring that has been cut through in one place so that it could be pried off the wooden felloes. The gap where the tire once sat is visible on the wheel, and the bare oak shows a lighter color where it was protected from the weather and the road dust. Thomas walks over to the wheel and runs his hand along the exposed wood, feeling for any roughness that might need smoothing before the new tire goes on. The wood is dry and sound, with no sign of rot or cracking beyond the small shallow lines that come with age. He nods to himself and returns to the forge. Now Ned brings out the new iron bar from where it lay along the wall, lifting it with both hands and carrying it across the yard. The bar is heavy, and he walks with a slight lean backward to balance the weight, his boots pressing deep into the damp earth. He sets it on a pair of low trestles near the forge, where it will be within easy reach when the fire is ready. The bar is dark grey, rough with mill scale, and straight as a rule, 8 feet of wrought iron that has travelled by cart from the ironmonger's yard 2 villages over. In a few hours, this straight bar will be curved into a perfect circle and then hammered and heated until it fits the old wheel with a grip that will last for decades. But for now it is only a length of cold metal, dull and unremarkable, waiting for the fire. The light outside has grown stronger while they worked, and the mist has nearly vanished except for a few low ribbons that cling to the brook bed. The thatched roofs are drying to a warm brown, and the first real sunlight, thin and golden, breaks through the thinning clouds and touches the stones of the Smithy yard. A pair of sparrows have found a perch on the top of the open door, and they chatter softly to each other, their small heads turning this way and that. Thomas glances up at them, but says nothing. The birds are part of the smithy, as much a fixture as the anvil or the bellows, and he has long since stopped noticing when they come and go. He takes a small steel striker and a piece of flint from the shelf beside the door, then kneels once more by the forge. With a quick, practiced motion, he strikes the flint against the steel just above the tallow-smeared cloth, and the shower of tiny sparks falls onto the tinder. One spark catches, then another, and a thin curl of smoke rises as the cloth begins to smoulder. He leans down and blows gently, not hard, just a steady stream of breath that feeds the tiny flame until it grows strong enough to lick at the birch twigs. The twigs crackle softly, their dry bark catching with little pops, and soon the first small flames dance among the logs. Ned moves quietly to the bellows and begins to pump the top board with a slow, even motion, sending a steady stream of air through the tuyere and into the heart of the growing fire. The coals begin to glow in scattered spots, orange and red points of light that spread slowly through the blackness like stars coming out in a dark sky. The fire will take time to build, and neither man is in a hurry to rush it. Thomas stands and brushes the ash from his knees, then walks to the open door and looks out at the lane. A dog trots past, a brown and white terrier that belongs to the farmer down the way, and it pauses to sniff at the threshold before continuing on its rounds. The farmer himself would arrive later in the day, when the tire is ready to be seated onto the wheel, bringing his quiet presence and his strong arms to help with the sledgehammers. Until then, there is only the work of preparation, the slow gathering of heat and tools, the filling of the smithy with the smell of burning charcoal, and the low, steady roar of the fire. The wheel waits, the iron waits, and the village continues its slow turn through the morning, unhurried and at peace. When the fire in the forge has settled into a steady glow and the first warmth begins to push back the chill from the smithy corners, Thomas turns his attention fully to the old wagon wheel that has been waiting by the wall. The wheel is not a small thing. It stands nearly to his chest, and its weight is such that 2 men are needed to carry it comfortably, though one strong man can roll it along on its rim with careful balance. Today, Thomas does not carry it. He grips the spokes with both hands and tips the wheel forward until its worn iron tire touches the packed earth. Then he rolls it slowly across the yard and into the wide doorway of the smithy, where the light is best. The wheel makes a low, rumbling sound as it turns, a sound that speaks of heavy loads and long roads, and small bits of dried mud flake off the rim and fall to the floor. He steadies the wheel against a low trestle that stands just inside the threshold, a sturdy frame of oak built to hold wheels at a comfortable working height. With a gentle lift, he settles the hub onto the iron pin that rises from the trestle, and the wheel sits there, upright and balanced, free to spin if you give it a push, but still now, waiting to be examined. The trestle holds the wheel so that his outer rim is at the level of Thomas's waist, and he can walk around it without stooping. The light from the open door falls across the wood in a broad, soft band, showing every grain and every scar. The forge fire crackles quietly behind him, and Ned is tending the bellows with a slow, steady rhythm. But his eyes follow Thomas's movements because he knows that learning comes as much from watching as from doing. Thomas begins the examination by simply standing still and looking at the wheel as a whole. He lets his eyes travel around the full circle, taking in the shape of it, the way the spokes meet the hub, the way the felloes join together to form the rim. There are 8 spokes in total, each one carved from a single piece of straight-grained oak, and they radiate from the hub like the rays of a wooden sun. The hub itself is a thick, rounded block of elm wood, darker than the spokes, with a square hole through its center where the axle will fit. Around the hub there are 2 iron bands, hoops that have been shrunk on just as the tire is shrunk on the rim, and these bands keep the hub from splitting under the stress of heavy loads. Thomas has seen thousands of hubs in his life, and he can read them as a shepherd reads the sky. This one is old but solid, the iron bands still tight, the wood around them showing only the fine, shallow cracks that come with age, and are no cause for worry. He reaches out and places his palm flat against the side of the hub, feeling the smoothness of the elm that has been polished by years of grease and the rubbing of the axle. His hand is broad and steady, and it rests there for a moment, absorbing the temperature of the wood that is cool but not cold. Then he moves his hand outward along one of the spokes, tracing the line of the grain with his fingertips. The spoke is shaped with a slight taper, thicker where it enters the hub and thinner where it meets the felloe, a shape that gives it strength without adding unnecessary weight. The surface is not perfectly smooth. There are small ridges left by the draw knife that shaped it long ago, and these ridges have been worn down in places where the wheelwright's hands have gripped it during previous repairs. Thomas feels these ridges with a kind of quiet appreciation, the way a carpenter might feel the marks of an old chisel on a beam, because they tell the story of the wheel's making and its mending. He works his way methodically around the wheel, touching each spoke in turn. Some feel exactly like the first one, firm and dry, with no give or movement under pressure. When he reaches the 4th spoke, however, he pauses and presses harder with his thumb where the spoke meets the phyllo band. There is a tiny movement there, so small that you would not notice it if you did not know what to feel for. A slight give that suggests the wood has dried and shrunk just enough to loosen its seat in the mortise. Thomas makes a soft sound in his throat, less a word than a quiet note of observation, and he takes a small wedge-shaped piece of hard oak from his apron pocket, holding it up to the light. The wedge is thin and tapered, no longer than his little finger, and he slips it into the tiny gap between the spoke and the felloe, tapping it gently with the heel of his hand until it sits snug. Then he breaks off the protruding end with a sharp twist of his fingers and rubs the spot smooth with his thumb. The repair is so small that Ned, watching from the bellows, barely sees it happen. It is not a fault, only a routine correction, one of 100 small adjustments that keep a wheel rolling true for another season. From the spokes, Thomas moves outward to the felloes, the curved sections of oak that are joined end to end to form the rim of the wheel. This wheel has 6 felloes, each one carefully shaped to follow the circle, and they are fastened together with dowels and with the same kind of tight joinery that holds the spokes. It is onto these felloes that the iron tire will be shrunk, so the condition of the wood here is of great importance. Thomas crouches down so that his eyes are level with the rim, and he slowly turns the wheel a few inches at a time, examining the full length of each felloe under the soft daylight. The wood is dark with age and exposure, almost a grey-brown, and the outer surface is slightly roughened where the old tire has rubbed against it for years. There are small, shallow cracks running with the grain, none of them deep enough to matter, and a few spots where a stone from the road has left a tiny dent. Thomas presses his thumbnail into one of these dents, feeling the hardness of the compacted wood, and then he runs his finger along the entire circumference, feeling for any raised splinters or rough patches. There are none. He pays special attention to the joints between the felloes, those places where two curved pieces of wood meet end to end. These joints are the weakest points of any wooden rim, because they are where water can seep in and where the stress of the iron tire can cause the wood to shift. Thomas examines each joint with care, looking for any sign of widening or looseness. He carries a thin knife in his belt, and he uses its point to gently probe the edges of one joint, testing whether the dowel inside is still holding firm. The knife tip meets only solid wood, no softness or rot, and he nods slightly before moving on to the next. One by one, all 6 joints prove sound. It is the kind of methodical inspection that feels slow while it is happening, but it is exactly this slowness that ensures the wheel will not fail on a rocky road far from any repair. Thomas does not hurry because there is no reason to hurry. The fire is still building, the iron is still cold, and the sun has only just cleared the rooftops. After the joints are checked, Thomas turns his attention to the very heart of the wheel, the hub. He grasps the wheel by the rim and gives it a gentle spin on the trestle, watching the hub turn. It should turn perfectly true, with no wobble, and he watches closely as the dark iron bands rotate against the lighter wood. The spin is smooth, the hub centered, and the wheel slows to a stop without any off-balance rocking. He then leans closer to examine the square axle hull. Inside, the wood is darker still, almost black, where the grease and the friction of countless miles have burned the fibers to a hard, polished surface. Thomas takes a small scoop of tallow from a pot on the bench and works it into the hole with his fingers, spreading it evenly along all 4 sides. The tallow is cool and slightly grainy, smelling of mutton fat, and it will lubricate the axle and keep the hub from cracking. He adds just enough to coat the surface, no more, and then wipes his hands on a rag that hangs from his apron string. All of this observation and touching has given Thomas a clear picture of the wheel's condition. But there is one more step before he can be satisfied. He must measure the circumference of the wooden felloe band with exactness, so that the new iron tire will fit with the precise degree of tightness required. To do this, he reaches for the soft cord that hangs on the nail near the door. The cord is made of hemp, worn and darkened by the oil from many hands, and it has been used for this same purpose on dozens of wheels before this one. Thomas takes the end of the cord and holds it with his thumb at the point where 2 felloes meet, a convenient starting mark. Then, with his free hand, he feeds the cord slowly around the circumference of the wheel, keeping it snug against the wood, not pulling it too tight, but letting it lie flat and even. The cord makes a soft brushing sound as it moves over the oak, a sound like a whisper, and the fibers catch slightly on the grain before sliding free. He works his way all around the wheel, passing the cord under the spoke ends and over the joints until he returns to his starting point. At that exact spot, he pinches the cord between his thumb and forefinger to mark the length, then lifts it away carefully so that the measurement is not lost. With the cord held taut between his hands, he carries it to the workbench where the measuring stick waits. The stick is a plain length of ash, about 3 feet long, with a series of fine notches cut into its edge, each one representing a precise measurement that Thomas has used over the years. He lays the cord along the stick, matching one end to the 0 notch, and then follows the curve of the cord with his finger until he reaches the pinched point. That point falls between 2 notches, and he leans down to read the distance with care, counting the notches and the fractions between them. He then reaches for the slate that hangs by the bench and picks up a small piece of chalk. On the slate, he writes a number, the exact circumference of the wooden felloe band in inches and parts of an inch. This number will determine the length of the new iron tire, which must be made slightly shorter than the wood, so that when it is heated and expanded, it will slip over the rim, and when it cools and shrinks, it will grip the wood with a force that cannot be shaken loose by any rut or stone. Thomas erases the number once and writes it again, checking his work. He compares the cord to the measuring stick a second time just to be sure, and then a third time, because a mistake here would cost a day's labor and a bar of good iron. The figure is the same each time. He shows the slate to Ned, who has left the bellows and come over to the bench, and Ned reads the number silently, memorizing it. The apprentice does not speak, but his eyes show that he understands the importance of the measurement. Later, when they curve the iron bar into a hoop, they will check its inner circumference against this same chord, heating and hammering until the match is exact. It is a simple kind of mathematics, not written in books but held in hands and in chalk marks, handed down from one wheelwright to the next. Outside, the morning has fully arrived. The golden light that was only a promise earlier now floods the yard, drying the last dampness from the stones and warming the air just enough that Thomas pushes his wool cap back a little from his forehead. The sparrows on the smithy door have been joined by a third, and they chatter in short, soft bursts that punctuate the quiet rather than breaking it. The brook's voice carries on through it all, steady and unchanged. A small cart passes on the lane, drawn by a patient brown horse with a farmer walking alongside, and Thomas lifts his hand in a silent greeting. The farmer nods back, and the cart rolls on, its own wheels turning with a low creak that is as much a part of the village soundscape as the birds or the water. Thomas returns his gaze to the wheel on the trestle. He has examined every part of it now, the hub and its iron bands, the 8 spokes and their mortices, the 6 felloes and their joints, the bare wooden rim that will soon be wrapped in glowing iron. He has measured its circumference with cord and stick, written the number on the slate, and tucked the small wedge into the one loose spoke. The wheel is ready. It sits there in the doorway, turning slowly when a slight breeze pushes against it, catching the light on its old, seasoned surface. The wood is a warm, honeyed brown in the sun, and you can see the growth rings in the felloes like lines on a map. It is a good wheel, a strong wheel, one that has carried many loads of hay and stone and firewood, and it will carry many more after this day's work is done. Thomas takes the rag from his apron and wipes the chalk dust from his fingers, then folds the cord and hangs it back on its nail. The measuring stick goes back to its place, and the slate is propped on the bench where both men can see it. He glances at the fire, which is now a deep, steady orange under its bed of coals, and he judges that it is nearly time to begin heating the iron bar. But not just yet. The iron can wait a little longer while the smithy holds on to its morning calm, while the sunlight moves another inch across the floor, while the wheel turns just a fraction in the breeze. Everything that needs to happen will happen in its proper time, and no sooner. That is the rhythm of this place, the quiet pulse of work with iron and wood, and it asks nothing of you but your patience and your presence. The iron bar rests on its wooden trestles near the forge, a dark and silent weight that has waited all morning to be brought to life. It is not a thing of beauty yet, only a rough length of wrought metal with a skin of mill scale that feels like fine sand under the thumb. It has no shape that suggests a wheel. It is straight where a wheel is curved, cold where a wheel must be hot, and inert where a wheel must be tight and living. But inside the metal, unseen, there is a memory of the ore from which it was smelted, of the charcoal and the limestone and the long hours in the bloomery furnace, and now it waits for the smithy fire to call that memory back into something useful. Thomas stands over it for a short while, not touching it, simply looking at its length and its thickness and its straightness, judging how the curve will come and where the hammer must fall first. Ned has returned to the bellows and is pumping with the same steady pace, keeping the forge coals at a deep, even orange with no hot blasts and no cold gaps. The fire is ready. The first step is to bring the bar into the heat, but not all at once. Thomas takes one end of the bar with a pair of short-handled tongs, lifting it just enough to slide the low trestle sideways and make room on the hearth. Then he and Ned, working without any spoken command, lift the bar between them and carry it to the forge. They feed its leading end into the bright heart of the coals, laying it across the fire bricks so that only the first third of its length is buried in the glowing bed. The rest of the bar protrudes outward, cool and grey, resting on a support stand that keeps it level. This way the heat will travel slowly along the iron from one end to the other, and Thomas can work the curve section by section without losing the shape of the whole. The fire licks up around the metal, and at first there is no visible change beyond the slight hiss of moisture burning off the scale. The bellows continue their steady groan and sigh, and the forge room fills with the scent of hot iron and the low, constant sound of rushing air. Time passes in small, slow measures while the iron soaks up the heat. Thomas watches the color of the metal change through his long experience, knowing each shade as a gardener knows the colors of ripening fruit. First, the dark gray turns to a dull brown, and you might think nothing is happening if you did not know better. Then, a faint, rosy blush appears just at the edges of the bar where the coals touch it most closely. A blush that deepens into cherry red while the center remains dark. The red spreads inward gradually, like a sunrise across a cloudy sky, until the entire buried section glows the color of a winter hearth. Still Thomas waits, letting the heat penetrate deeper, because wrought iron that is hot only on the surface will crack under the hammer, but iron that is heated through and through will bend like warm wax. The air around the forge shimmers, and the heat presses against his face, but he does not flinch. He has stood before hotter fires many times, when the iron has reached a full yellow-orange, so bright that it is difficult to look at directly for long. Thomas gives a small nod. Ned stops pumping the bellows and steps back, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. The sudden silence is almost as loud as the roar was, and in that silence Thomas pulls the glowing bar from the coals with the long tongs, swinging it smoothly onto the anvil. The anvil is a heavy block of forged steel, old and dark, with a flat face and a conical horn at one side, and it sits on its oak base like a patient bullock. The hot iron meets the anvil face with a soft metallic thud, and a few bright sparks scatter upward before dying. Thomas does not waste a moment. He grips the tongs in his left hand and takes up the cross-peen hammer in his right. The hammer is a 3-pound head on a hickory handle, and its peen is a blunt wedge that will spread the metal in one direction when he strikes. He starts the curve at the very end of the bar, laying the cross-peen across the hot iron at a slight angle and striking with a series of firm, even blows. Each stroke pushes the metal just a little outward, widening the bar slightly on its inner face and making it want to bend. The sound of the hammer on the hot iron is not a sharp ring, but a dull, heavy thuck, 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 a sound that fills the smithy and then fades. Thomas works with a rocking rhythm, his arm rising and falling without haste, and after each few blows he pauses to check the curve by holding a wooden template against the iron. The template is a thin board cut to the exact arc of the finished tire, and he lays it against the glowing bar to see how closely the shape is following. The steam from the wood hisses softly, and the smell of scorched oak joins the iron in the air. He is not trying to make a perfect circle in one pass, only to coax the bar shyly into a curve that will eventually be closed. As the iron cools from yellow to cherry to a dull red, the hammer blows become less effective and the metal grows stubborn. Thomas returns the bar to the forge, sliding it back among the coals, and Ned resumes the bellows. While the iron reheats, Thomas takes a moment to examine the curve he has made so far, holding the template against it from several angles. The bend is gentle but smooth, with no flat spots or kinks, and it runs evenly from the worked end for about 2 feet. He runs a gloved finger along the hot metal, just quickly enough to feel the shape, and then waits for the fire to bring it back to the yellow heat. There is a patience in this work that has nothing to do with idleness. It is a patience of watching and waiting and knowing that the iron will yield only when it is ready. The morning continues to pass outside the open door. The sun is higher now, and the shadows have shortened. The sparrows have flown away, replaced by a single crow that sits on the roof peak and caws once before gliding off toward the fields. A woman passes on the lane carrying a basket of eggs, and she calls a soft, "Good day," to the open smithy, her voice carrying in the still air. Thomas lifts his hand in reply without turning from the forge. The brook, as always, runs on, and its sound is a thread that ties the hours together. Inside the smithy, the world has shrunk to the size of the fire and the anvil and the iron bar that is slowly, slowly becoming something else. When the bar glows bright again, Thomas draws it out and continues the bending, working now a little farther down the length. The hammer strokes overlap one another, each blow landing just ahead of the last, moving the curve forward inch by inch. The tongs creak in his grip as he turns the bar slightly between strikes, and the anvil hums its low, solid note. Ned watches from the bellows, his hands still on the lever, his eyes tracking the progress. He is learning to see what Thomas sees, the tiny changes of shape, the way the metal moves under the hammer like stiff dough. The importance of keeping the bar at the right angle to the peen. He knows that someday he will stand at the anvil himself and this watching is part of his own slow forging. Bit by bit, the straight bar becomes a long, gentle arc. Thomas works the heat in sections, advancing the curve along the iron, heating and hammering, heating and hammering, heating and hammering. Each reheating takes its own time, and there is no rushing the fire. The coals must be rearranged sometimes, pulled closer or pushed aside, and a fresh handful of charcoal is added now and then to keep the bed deep and hot. Ned tends these adjustments quietly, using a small rake to level the coals, and the fire responds with a brightening glow and a renewed crackle. The pile of scale that flakes off the iron under the hammer gathers on the floor around the anvil, tiny dark splinters that crunch underfoot when Thomas shifts his stance. When the bar is curved enough that its two ends can be brought near each other, Thomas stops the hammerwork and stands back. The iron is now a large crescent, nearly a three-quarter circle, and its shape is close to the template, but not yet exact. He and Ned lift it carefully, one on each side, and carry it to the trestle where the measuring cord waits. Thomas loops the soft cord around the inside of the curve, matching it to the circumference mark that he pinched earlier. The cord follows the iron, and where the ends of the crescent nearly meet, there is a small gap. The circle is not yet closed. He notes the distance with a glance, then returns the iron to the forge to bring the last unbent portion to heat. This final section is the most important, because it is where the two ends will overlap to form the joint, and if it is not shaped just right, the weld will be weak. The fire is stoked high for this last heating, and Ned works the bellows until the coals are a near white heat in the center. The tip of the iron bar goes in first, and Thomas watches as the color climbs rapidly through the reds and into the yellows, then into a pale lemon that is almost too bright to look upon. This is the welding heat, the temperature at which wrought iron becomes soft enough that two pieces can be hammered together into one seamless whole. He draws the bar ad with a quick, smooth pull, and the light from it casts harsh shadows on the walls. The everyday heroes who The everyday hift insulation tricks most as it touches the cooler air. There is no time to waste at this heat, so Thomas moves straight to the anvil, where a flat block of iron, called a swage block, has been set up to help form the scarf. The scarf is the lap joint that will unite the two ends of the tire. To make it, Thomas hammers the glowing tip out thin and tapered, a scarf that will lie over the other end of the hoop like a feather, overlapping another feather. He strikes quickly but with precise control, drawing the metal out so that it feathers to a fine edge, while Ned holds the other end of the crescent steady with the long tongs. The hammerwork at welding heat is louder and sharper, the blows ringing with a higher note, and the steam that rises from the water bucket where the hammer is occasionally dipped sends up quick, hissing plumes. In a short time, the scarf is formed, a thin, clean overlap waiting to be joined to its mate. Now the other end of the crescent is brought to the same white heat and scarfed in the same way, its edge thinned to mirror the first. The two ends are brought together on the anvil, overlapped perfectly so that their combined thickness will match the rest of the tire. Thomas sprinkles a pinch of clean, dry sand over the joint, the silica sand that will melt in the heat and form a glassy flux to protect the weld from the air. Then, with the two pieces held firm by Ned using the tongs, Thomas raises the hammer and begins to weld. The first blow is light, just enough to set the joint, and the sand spits and fizzes. The second blow is heavier, and the metal begins to fuse. Blow after blow falls in a steady rhythm, and the white-hot iron squirms slightly under the hammer, the two scarfed faces becoming one. Sparks fly outward in a bright shower, some landing in the water barrel with tiny sizzles. The sound of the hammer is a sharp, insistent ping now, higher than before, because the iron is harder at this heat. Thomas works the weld from the center outward, making sure there are no pockets or gaps, and the color of the joint fades from white to yellow to orange as the heat escapes into the air and the anvil. When the weld is complete, Thomas stops hammering and lets the iron cool on the anvil for a few breaths, just until it loses its glare and settles into a deep red. Then he and Ned lift the now closed hoop and carry it to the trestle. It is a circle at last, a rough but complete ring of wrought iron. The joint where the ends were welded is visible as a slightly thicker section with a rippled surface, but there are no cracks or gaps. And when Thomas taps it with a small hammer, it rings with one clean note, not the dead clunk of a failed weld. He nods once, satisfied. but the tire is not finished. It is a circle, but its circumference is still too large by a small amount, and its shape is not perfectly round. The next step is to true it on the anvil horn, using gentle hammer blows to bring it to the exact measurement written on the slate. Thomas reheats the entire hoop, not to welding heat this time, but to a bright orange, placing it over a specially built ring of coals so that the heat is even all around. When the color is uniform, he and Ned lift it out and hang it over the bighorn, the narrow conical point of the anvil. The horn allows Thomas to hammer on the inside of the hoop, expanding it outward just slightly where needed, or contracting it by hammering on the outside. He works his way around the wheel slowly, tapping the iron with the flat face of the hammer, checking the circle against a wooden gauge that he holds in his other hand. The gauge is a simple rod of wood with a mark on it that corresponds to the finished inner diameter. Each time he measures, he finds the high spots and brings them down with a few careful taps, and the low spots he coaxes outward by striking the inside over the horn. The metal is cooperative at this heat, moving in small increments, and he guides it toward the exact shape it must hold for decades. Ned brings the measuring cord again, and Thomas wraps it around the inside of the tire, comparing the length to the slate once more. The cord shows that the tire is now a careful finger's width shorter in circumference than the wooden fellow band. That is exactly right. When heated for the final time, this shortage will be overcome by the expansion of the metal, allowing the tire to slip onto the wheel. When it cools, it will shrink back to this size, gripping the wood with a force that cannot be undone. Thomas wipes the cord clean and hangs it back on its nail, and Ned pours a dipper of water over the tire to bring it down to a workable temperature. The hiss of the water is loud and brief, and a cloud of steam billows up before dissolving into the rafters. The tire is now a true hoop of wrought iron, its surface dark with scale, and its weld smooth and strong. It lies on the stone floor, cooling slowly, while Thomas and Ned stand back and look at it. The work of the morning has taken several hours, though it does not feel like it inside the smithy, where time is measured in heats rather than in minutes. Outside, the sun has climbed to the top of the sky, and the shadows are short and dark. The crow has returned to the roof, and a light breeze moves through the open door, stirring the fine dust on the floor. The wheel still sits on its trestle, waiting, its bare wooden rims seeming almost golden in the midday light. The iron tire and the oak wheel are now almost ready for each other. Only the last great heat and the careful placing remain. But that is for later. For now, the smithy rests in a brief, calm interval, the forge crackling low, the hammer silent, and the two craftsmen sharing a quiet moment of satisfaction that no words could improve upon. Once the welded hoop has cooled enough that its surface no longer glares with an angry orange, but has settled into a deep, quiet grey, Thomas and Ned lift it from the stone floor and carry it to the forge. The iron is still warm to the touch, radiating a gentle heat that can be felt on the face from a few inches away, and the smell of it is like dry, hot stone after a long summer day. They set it down on the hearth bricks for a moment, while Thomas examines the bed of coals. The fire has been kept at a steady, low roar throughout the morning, but now it must be prepared for a different purpose. Not the concentrated heat of forging or welding, but a broad, even heat that will bring the entire tire to a uniform expansion without any one section growing hotter than another. To achieve this, he takes up the long fire rake and draws the glowing coals outward from the center, spreading them into a flat, circular bed that is slightly larger than the tire itself. He arranges them with care, pushing the brighter coals to the edges where the iron will lose heat more quickly to the air, and leaving a layer of slightly cooler but still intensely hot coals in the middle. The fire bricks beneath are now covered with a deep, pulsating orange carpet that breathes with the rhythm of the bellows. Ned steps to the bellows without being asked, his hands finding the smooth wooden handle, and he begins to pump with the same unhurried cadence that has marked all their work. The bellows are large, made of two leather chambers that open and close like the lungs of a slumbering ox, and each stroke sends a long, steady stream of air up through the tuyere into the heart of the fire. The coals respond by brightening momentarily, individual lumps flaring from orange to yellow before settling back, and the sound that fills the smithy is a deep, throaty whisper that never quite becomes a roar. It is a sound you can feel in your chest if you stand close enough, a low vibration that blends with the trickle of the brook outside and the occasional call of a distant crow, so constant that after a time you stop hearing it as a separate thing and it becomes simply the voice of the morning. When the coal bed is prepared, Thomas and Ned take up the long tongs, each gripping one side of the iron hoop, and they lower it carefully onto the glowing bed. The tire does not drop with a clang. It settles gently, the rough scale on its underside crunching softly against the hot coals, and at first there is hardly any change in the sound or the look of it. The iron, being thick and dense, does not heat quickly, and Thomas has no intention of rushing it. He stands back a step, wiping his hands on his apron, and watches as the dark grey surface begins its slow transformation. The first sign is almost too subtle to notice, a slight darkening of the colour, as if a shadow were passing over the metal, followed by a faint brownish bloom that spreads outward from the points where the coals touch the tire most directly. This brown, which is the colour of dried oak leaves in late autumn, deepens slowly, creeping across the hoop in patches that merge and separate and merge again. The fire hisses occasionally when a small piece of scale pops loose from the expanding metal and falls into the coals, but otherwise the process is silent, except for the steady breath of the bellows. The brown begins to give way to a soft, velvety red, the colour of a ripe cherry held up to the dusk sky. This red does not arrive all at once. It starts at the inner edge of the tire, where the metal is slightly thinner and works its way outward toward the thicker outer rim. The transition is so gradual that if you looked away for a moment and then looked back, you might not be certain that anything had changed at all. But when you keep your eyes on it, you can see the colour deepening almost imperceptibly, like the shifting of the tide. The heat waves that rise from the fire shimmer the air above the tire, making the rafters and the roof seem as though they are underwater, wavering gently. The warmth presses against Thomas's face and hands, a dry, insistent heat that is not painful but that reminds him of the power contained in the coals, and he squints slightly against the brightness as the red intensifies into a clear, glowing orange. While the tire heats, Thomas turns his attention to the area where the wheel will stand during the fitting. Just outside the forge, where the stone floor of the smithy meets the packed earth of the yard, there is a flat, broad flagstone that has been used for this purpose many times. It is worn smooth in the center from years of heavy wheels being rolled across it, and the edges are dark, with old soot and dried quenching water. Thomas sends Ned to fetch a bucket of fresh water from the barrel, and the apprentice carries it over with both hands, setting it carefully at the edge of the flagstone, so that it will be close by when the moment comes to pour water over the hot tire. A wooden ladle floats in the bucket, its handle sticking up at an angle. The water inside is cool and still, reflecting a small square of the open door and the pale autumn sky. Already a faint wisp of steam rises from the damp spots on the flagstone, where the stone is still moist from yesterday's quenching, thin white threads that curl upward and dissolve into the air without a sound. Now the wooden wheel itself is brought over. Thomas and Ned tip it off its trestle and roll it slowly across the smithy floor, guiding it with gentle nudges of their hands until it sits upright on the flagstone, perfectly centered. The wheel is still bare on its outer rim, the old iron tire having been removed the day before, and the exposed oak looks pale and slightly rough in the firelight, almost golden where the sun from the doorway touches it. Thomas walks around the wheel once, checking that it is level and that the ground beneath it is solid. Then he crouches to examine the wooden felloe band one last time. He runs his palm around the entire circumference, feeling for any grit or moisture that might prevent the hot tire from seating evenly. The wood is dry and clean, with a slight warmth from being near the forge but no dampness. He nods to himself and stands back. The tire now glows a deep, uniform orange, the color of the coals themselves, and the heat that radiates from it has grown strong enough that Thomas must shield his eyes with his forearm when he leans close to check its expansion. He reaches for a pair of long iron calipers that hang on a peg near the anvil. These calipers are a simple tool, two curved legs of iron joined by a pivot with pointed tips that can be set against the inner surface of the tire to measure its diameter. They have been used on many tires before this one, and their iron is dark with age and handling. Thomas holds them by the joint and tests their movement, opening and closing them a few times to make sure the pivot is not stiff. Then he approaches the glowing hoop. Standing at a careful distance, He sets one tip of the calipers against the inside edge of the tire, and then slowly brings the other tip around to the opposite side. The iron is so hot that the caliper tips almost seem to want to stick to it, but he works with deliberate slowness, making sure the measurement is true. When both tips are in place, he withdraws the calipers and steps back into the cooler air near the door, where he can read the small notch that marks the starting circumference. He holds the calipers up to the light, squinting at the gap between the two legs, and compares it to the chalk mark on the slate that still rests on the bench. The gap has widened by a small amount since the tire was cold, just enough to be visible to an experienced eye, but not yet enough to fit over the wooden rim. The iron must expand further, until the inner diameter is slightly larger than the fellow band, so that the tire will drop over the wood without forcing. Thomas sets the calipers aside and returns his gaze to the fire. The heating will continue a while longer. Ned, who has been keeping the bellows steady, pauses to wipe his brow and glance at the tire. The young apprentice can feel the heat from across the smithy, and he sees the air dancing above the orange ring. He knows better than to speak or to hurry. He simply continues his work, the handle of the bellows going up and down with the same quiet persistence. The sound of the bellows is like the breathing of the smithy itself, and it never falters. As the heat builds, the color of the tire shifts again, moving from orange into a brighter, yellower range. This is the color of a candle flame seen through a thin slice of horn, pale and shimmering at the edges. At this heat, the iron is expanding more rapidly, and the scale on its surface begins to flake away in thin, curling sheets that drift upward on the rising air before settling onto the surrounding bricks as fine, dark dust. Tiny sparks occasionally leap from the coals and land on the tire, where they skitter across the glowing surface before winking out. The smell of the hot iron changes too, becoming sharper and cleaner, with a mineral tang that fills the back of the throat. Thomas stands nearby, his arms folded, watching the color and feeling the expansion, as if the iron were telling him something in a language only he understood. He picks up the calipers from time to time, measuring the inner diameter with quick, efficient movements. Each time, the gap has widened by another fraction of an inch, and each time he compares it to the measurement on the slate. The chalk marks are smudged now from the heat and the dust, but the numbers are still clear. He calculates the difference in his head without writing anything down, knowing from long practice exactly how much clearance he needs. Too little, and the tire will stick partway onto the wheel, a disaster that would require cutting it off and starting again. Too much, and the tire will drop on loosely, and the shrinkage might not grip the wood with enough force. The perfect fit is a matter of a single thin finger's width, and he waits for that precise moment with the calm of a fisherman watching a float on still water. Outside, the day has moved into its later morning hours, and the sun is now high enough to stream directly through the open door, casting a bright, warm parallelogram of light across the smithy floor. The dust motes that have been stirred up by the slow work drift lazily through this light, tiny flecks of gold that appear and disappear. The brook continues its murmur, joined now by the distant sound of a woman singing softly as she hangs washing on a line behind one of the cottages. The song is too faint to make out the words, only the rise and fall of the melody, and it fades in and out with the breeze. The farmer who will help with the sledgehammers has not yet arrived, but his cart is visible on the lane, approaching slowly, the horse walking with its head low and the farmer half dozing on the seat. Everything is unhurried, as if the world itself is waiting for the tire to be ready. The tire has now reached the heat that Thomas has been waiting for. The color is a pale, luminous yellow, almost white at the very edges, and the inner diameter, as measured by the calipers, shows a gap that is exactly right, a finger's width larger than the wooden fellow band. The heat is so intense that the stone floor beneath the tire has begun to steam where a few stray drops of water fell earlier, and the bucket of quenching water, though several feet away, has a faint ripple on its surface from the vibrations of the bellows. Thomas sets the calipers down one last time and turns to Ned, who has stopped pumping and is looking at him with an expectant stillness. They share a look that needs no words, a look that says the time has come. But even now Thomas does not rush. He allows the tire to soak for a few more breaths in the coals, letting the heat penetrate to the very core of the metal so that the expansion is thorough and not merely a skin-deep glow. He checks the long tongs, making sure their jaws are clean and will grip the tire without slipping. He moves the bucket of water a hand's breadth closer to the flagstone so that it will be within easy reach when the quenching begins. He nudges the wheel with his foot to make sure it is still seated firmly on the flat stone. And then he stands, watching the shimmering air and the pale glowing ring, his hands relaxed at his sides, his breathing slow and even. The smithy holds its breath, the bellows silent for the first time in an hour, and the only sound is the gentle crackle of the coals and the distant fading song from the lane. The wheel waits, the water waits, and the tire glows with the heat that will soon bind it to the oak forever. The moment has come when the tire must leave the fire and travel the short, slow distance to the waiting wheel. Thomas stands at the forge with the light of the glowing hoop casting deep shadows across his face, and he feels the familiar weight of the moment settle over him like a heavy wool cloak. It is not a moment of hurry or of high emotion, but of careful, measured attention, the kind that comes when a task cannot be undone once it is begun. He rolls his shoulders once, loosening the muscles that have tightened from standing still, and he looks across at Ned, who has left the bellows and now stands with the second pair of long tongs held ready in both hands. The apprentice's face is calm and serious, lit from below by the orange glow, and there is no trace of the nervousness that might grip a younger boy. He has done this before, not many times, but enough to know that a steady hand and a quiet mind are the only tools he needs beyond the iron in his grip. Thomas takes up his own pair of tongs, the older pair with the handles worn dark and smooth from decades of use. He tests the jaws by opening and closing them once, feeling the familiar resistance of the pivot, and then he steps to the edge of the forge. The tire lies in its bed of coals like a ring of captured sunlight, pale and luminous, and the heat that comes off it is a physical pressure against the skin. He inserts the jaws of his tongs under the near side of the hoop, finding a secure purchase on the thickest part of the metal, and he nods to Ned, who does the same on the far side. They lift together, slowly, giving the tire time to clear the coals without any sudden movement that might cause a slip. As it rises from the fire, the tire seems almost to float for a moment, so bright is it against the darker smithy interior, and a shower of tiny sparks trickles from its underside like water droplets shaken from a wet hand. The weight of the tire is considerable, even shared between two strong men. It is not so heavy that they cannot carry it, but it is heavy enough that every step must be placed with care. They move with a slow, shuffling gait, their boots scuffing softly on the stone floor. Their bodies turn slightly inward toward each other, so that the hoop remains level between them. The long handles of the tongs creak under the strain, a low wooden sound that is almost lost in the hiss of the hot iron meeting the cooler air. That hiss is a quiet, insistent whisper, like the sound of a cat's warning breath drawn out long and steady, and it accompanies them across the smithy as they carry the glowing circle toward the door. The heat waves rise from the tire in a continuous shimmer, making the world beyond the iron seem to tremble and waver. The wooden rafters, the stone walls, the open door, all of them ripple gently as if seen through a pane of old glass. They approach the flagstone where the wheel stands waiting, its bare oak rim pale and patient in the morning light. Thomas stops them a few inches short of the wheel, adjusting his grip so that the tire hovers just above the floor. The wooden wheel is perfectly still, its spokes casting 8 narrow shadows across the flagstone, its hub dark with old grease. The moment feels suspended in a kind of quiet that is deeper than ordinary silence, a held-breath stillness that exists only in the small space between preparation and action. Thomas looks at the tire, then at the wheel, then at Ned, and he speaks the first words either of them has uttered in some time, his voice low and even, steady now. We lower it together. Ned answers with a barely perceptible nod, his eyes fixed on the glowing hoop, and they begin the final movements. They lift the tire just a little higher, enough to clear the top of the wheel, and then they step forward in unison. The tire passes over the upper rim of the wheel with a fraction of an inch to spare, the hot iron gliding above the wood without touching it, and you can see the thin gap of clear air between them, shimmering with heat. Then, with the same careful coordination, they begin to lower it. The tire descends slowly toward the fellow band, and the air between the iron and the wood grows thinner and thinner until at last the metal touches the oak in a dozen small places all at once. The first contact is almost gentle, a soft, barely audible tick as the blowing iron kisses the dry wood, and a thin curl of white smoke rises from the meeting point. The smoke is the color of cream, and it twists upward in a lazy spiral, carrying with it the smell of scorched oak that is sweet and sharp at the same time. As the tire settles deeper onto the wheel, more points of contact are made, and the smoke thickens. It does not billow or rush. It rises in slow, curling plumes that wrap around the spokes and drift toward the open door. The sound of the hot iron against the wood is a series of faint, creaking notes, like the sound of a heavy branch swaying in a slow wind. Thomas and Ned lower the tire the last inch with a deliberate, unhurried motion, and then the hoop is fully seated around the fellow band, its inner surface pressed against the oak all around the circumference. The tire is still glowing orange, though its brightness has already begun to dim at the edges, where the cooler wood is drawing the heat out of the metal. The wood itself has begun to darken where the tire touches it, a narrow band of chocolate brown that will later turn to a permanent dark char that protects the oak from moisture and decay. This charring is not damage, it is part of the design, a seal that forms between the iron and the wood, and its smell fills the smithy with a rich, earthy fragrance. Now the tire is on, but it is not yet fully seated. The metal, still hot and slightly larger than the fellow band, sits loosely on the wood, and if it were allowed to cool without being guided, it might settle unevenly and cause the wheel to wobble. To prevent this, Thomas picks up a wooden mallet from the floor beside the flagstone, a heavy mallet made of beechwood with a short handle and a broad, flat head. The mallet is dark with age, and has been used for this same purpose on many tires over the years. He grips it firmly and begins to tap the top edge of the tire, moving around the wheel in a slow circle. The taps are light and precise, not meant to force the tire down, but to encourage it to settle evenly, to find its natural seat on the wood. Each tap produces a dull wooden thock that is accompanied by a tiny puff of smoke where the mallet head meets the hot iron. The sound is quiet and rhythmic, thock and pause, and it blends with the crackle of the forge and the distant murmur of the brook. As Thomas taps, Ned stands ready with a ladle of water. He has dipped it into the bucket that waits beside the flagstone, and he holds it now with both hands, the water trembling slightly from his grip, but not spilling. Thomas works his way around the wheel one full turn, then a second, checking the alignment by sight and by the feel of the mallet. When he is satisfied that the tire is sitting true, he steps back and looks at Ned, giving a small, quiet nod. This is the signal for the first quenching. Ned steps forward and slowly tilts the ladle, pouring a thin stream of water over one section of the glowing tire. The water strikes the hot iron and vanishes instantly into a great cloud of steam that hisses upward with a sudden, rushing sound. The steam is thick and white and full, rolling outward from the point of contact like a wave, and it carries with it the sharp, clean smell of hot metal meeting cold water. The tire darkens immediately where the water touched it, transforming from pale orange to a deep blue-black in a heartbeat, and you can hear the iron make a tiny pinging sound as it contracts, a sound like a distant bell heard through a fog. The wood beneath that section of the tire releases its own hiss, softer and shorter, and then it falls silent as the steam dissipates into the rafters. Ned pours another ladle of water, this time a little farther along the circumference, and the same sequence repeats. The hiss, the cloud, the darkening, the quiet. He works with a slow, steady rhythm, pouring and pausing, while Thomas turns the wheel by small degrees between each pour so that the quenching advances evenly around the entire circle. Neither man speaks. The only sounds are the water, the steam, the creak of the cooling iron, and the soft rumble of the wheel turning on the flagstone. The steam clouds rise and mingle and drift toward the open door, where they catch the sunlight and glow for a moment like a solid thing before dissolving into the outside air. The smithy fills with a warm, damp haze that softens all the edges and makes the forge fire seem distant and dreamlike. The iron shrinks with every pour, its grip on the wood tightening as the circumference decreases. You cannot see the shrinkage with your eyes, but you can hear it in the low, groaning creaks that come from the wheel as the wood is compressed uniformly by the contracting metal band. These are not sounds of distress, but of union, the protest of two materials being forced together by forces that will hold them for decades. The oak, which was slightly charred on its outer edge by the initial touch of the hot tire, is now being squeezed inward with a pressure that is immense, but perfectly even. The spokes transmit this pressure to the hub, and the whole wheel becomes a single, tightly bound structure, every part pushing against every other part in a balance that only grows stronger as the cooling continues. Thomas watches the tire closely as Ned continues the quenching. The color of the iron has now gone from blue-black to a dull, dark gray, and only a few sections still show any trace of glow. He directs Ned with small gestures, a tilt of his hand here, a nod there, making sure that no part of the tire is cooled too quickly or left too hot. The goal is an even, gradual cooling that will set the grit firmly without making the iron brittle. The last few ladles of water are poured over the weld joint, which has been the hottest part of the tire and must be coaxed down slowly, and then the quenching is done. Ned sets the ladle back in the bucket, and the two men stand back from the wheel, their arms hanging loose at their sides, their breath returning to a normal, easy rhythm. The tire is now a dark matte grey all round, its surface rough with scale and marked here and there with the lighter grey spots where the water hit most directly. Steam still rises from it in thin, lazy wisps, and the smell of wet iron and charred oak hangs heavy in the air. The wheel sits on the flagstone in a ring of drying water, the puddle around its base already beginning to shrink as the stone absorbs the moisture. You can feel the heat radiating from the tire even from several feet away, a gentle, encompassing warmth that will take hours to fully dissipate. The iron is still too hot to touch, but its grip on the wood is already firm, and it will only grow tighter as the hours pass and the metal cools to the temperature of the air. Thomas reaches out with the back of his hand, not touching the tire but holding it close enough to gauge the warmth, and he nods once to himself. The placing is done. The tire is on, the quenching is complete, and the wheel has accepted its new iron band. Soon the farmer will arrive with his strong arms and the sledgehammers will begin their slow, rhythmic tapping, but for now the smithy rests in the quiet aftermath of the steam. The sun continues its slow climb, the brook continues its murmur, and the wheel, bound in its new tire, sits at the center of the flagstone like a thing newly born into the world. The steam from the quenching has not yet fully cleared when a shadow falls across the open doorway and the farmer steps quietly into the smithy. He is a man named John, broad in the shoulder and slow in his movements, with hands that have held plough handles and sledgehammer shafts for more than 30 years. He wears a simple wool coat the color of dry earth, and his boots are caked with the pale mud of the lane. He does not announce himself with words. He simply stands at the threshold until Thomas looks up and gives a small nod of welcome, and then he steps inside, leaning his own long-handled sledgehammer against the wall beside the others, as if it has always belonged there. The farmer has done this work before many times, and he knows that his role is not to direct, but to follow the rhythm that Thomas sets. A rhythm as old as the iron in the forge, and as steady as the turning of the seasons. The three men stand for a moment in the quiet, looking at the wheel on the flagstone. The tire is still sending up thin wisps of steam from the last ladles of water, and the iron is a deep, dark grey that holds no glow but radiates a warmth that can be felt from several paces away. The smell of scorched oak and hot metal is thick in the air, mingling with the older smells of charcoal and leather and stone. Outside, the morning has grown bright and clear, the last of the mist long gone, and the brook sparkles where the sun touches it through the thinning willow branches. A light breeze moves through the open door, stirring the steam into slow, rolling coils that twist upward toward the rafters and then dissolve into nothing. The smithy feels suspended in a pocket of time that has no hurry in it, a space where the next thing will happen only when everything is ready for it. Thomas picks up his sledgehammer from where it leans against the anvil block. It is a heavy tool, its head made of forged steel and its handle of straight-grained ash, and it has been with him since he was a young man, learning the trade from his own father. The handle is worn to a dark polish in the places where his hands always grip, the wood fibers compressed by decades of use into a surface as smooth as bone. He checks the head by giving it a small shake, feeling the tightness of the wedge that holds it to the shaft. And then he rests the hammer on his shoulder as casually as a woodman rests his axe. John does the same with his own hammer, a slightly shorter tool with a broader face, and the two of them take up their positions on opposite sides of the wheel. There is no ceremony to it, No words exchanged about who will stand where. John moves to the far side of the flagstone, and Thomas remains on the near side, and they turn to face the wheel together. The apprentice, Ned, stands a few steps back, ready to turn the wheel when the time comes. The purpose of the sledgehammer work is not to force the tire down with violence, but to guide it into its final seat with a series of precise, measured taps. Although the tire has been lowered onto the fellow band and has already begun to shrink from the quenching, there are small unevennesses in the wood and in the iron that must be settled out before the cooling is complete. The tire must sit perfectly flat against the felloe, not tilted by even a hair's breadth, because a wheel that is not true will shake itself apart on a rough road. The hammer blows will encourage the iron to find this perfect seat while it is still warm enough to move slightly, and the rhythm of the tapping will be slow enough that the metal can respond without being shocked. It is work that requires a delicate touch hidden inside a heavy tool, and both Thomas and John possess that touch in abundance. Thomas swings first. He lifts the sledgehammer with both hands, the handle sliding through his grip as the head rises, and then he brings it down in a controlled arc that ends with the flat face of the hammer striking the top edge of the tire. The blow is not hard. It is a tap, a nudge, a suggestion delivered through steel. The sound it makes is a deep, solid thud that reverberates through the iron and into the wood, a sound that you feel in the soles of your feet as much as you hear it with your ears. A fraction of a second after Thomas's blow lands, John swings from his side, and his hammer strikes the tire at a point directly opposite. The two sounds are close together but distinct, thud and thud, like the footsteps of a large animal walking slowly across a wooden bridge. Then there is a pause, a space of silence that lasts just long enough for the vibration in the iron to fade, and Thomas swings again. Thud, pause, thud, pause, thud. And the smithy fills with this steady, alternating percussion that is as regular as a sleeping heartbeat. With each set of taps, the tire settles a tiny bit deeper onto the fellow band. The movement is almost too small to see, a fraction of a hair's breadth at a time, but you can tell it is happening because the sound of the hammer blows changes subtly as the iron finds more wood beneath it. The initial thuds have a slightly hollow quality, a resonance that comes from the tire not yet sitting flat against the oak all around. As the tapping continues, that hollowness fades and is replaced by a solider, shorter note, a thuck rather than a thud, and this change tells Thomas that the tire is making full contact with the fellow band in more and more places. He listens to the sound as a musician listens to a tuning string, and he adjusts the force and placement of his blows accordingly, striking a little harder here, a little softer there, tilting the hammer face by a degree or two when the iron needs to be coaxed in a particular direction. John follows Thomas's lead without needing any spoken instruction. The farmer watches the master wheelwright's hammer and matches his rhythm exactly, striking when Thomas pauses and pausing when Thomas strikes. Their hammers rise and fall in a slow, unbroken dance, and the two men breathe in the same rhythm, their shoulders moving together, their feet planted wide and steady on the flagstone. The work is not exhausting, but it is steady, and after a time a faint sheen of sweat appears on Thomas's forehead and at the back of John's neck. Neither man wipes it away, they simply continue, their focus narrowed to the circle of dark iron and the sound of the hammers and the slow, incremental settling of the tire. Ned stands by, watching the progress with the attentive stillness of a young man who is learning a trade that cannot be learned from books. He counts the sets of taps in his head without meaning to, and he notices the tiny changes in the sound, just as Thomas does. After a dozen sets, Thomas gives a small gesture with his free hand, a slight upward flick of his fingers, and Ned steps forward to turn the wheel. He grips the rim with both hands, careful to avoid the still hot tire, and he rotates the wheel by a few inches, just enough to bring a new section of the tire under the hammers. Then he steps back, and the tapping resumes. Thud and thud, thud and thud, the rhythm unbroken. The process repeats, tap, listen, feel, turn, tap again. The steam that had been billowing from the quenching has now faded almost entirely, replaced by a thin, dry haze that hangs in the air and catches the sunlight in long, slanted bands. The smell of the smithy has shifted again, the sharpness of the quench giving way to the warmer, older smell of heated iron cooling slowly, a smell like sun-warmed stones after a light rain. Outside, the village has woken fully into its day. A cart trundles past on the lane, its driver humming a tune that fades in and out of hearing. Somewhere beyond the brook, a dog barks twice, and then falls silent. The smithy door stands open to all of these sounds, but inside the three men remain in their own quiet world, a world bounded by the flagstone and the wheel and the slow rhythm of the hammers. As the tapping continues, the tire grows cooler and its grip on the wood tightens with every passing minute. The iron is no longer hot enough to char the oak, but it is still warm enough to hold a slight expansion, and as that expansion fades, the metal shrinks inward with a force that is both immense and silent. You cannot see the shrinkage, but you can hear its effects in the creaks and groans that sometimes come from the wheel between hammer blows. These are not loud sounds. They are soft and low, like the settling noises of an old house at night, and they seem to come from deep within the wood itself. The spokes, which have been driven into their mortises years ago and have weathered many seasons since, are now being pulled even tighter by the compression of the rim, and the whole structure of the wheel is knitting itself into a single, unified whole. Each spoke presses outward against the felloe, and the felloe presses inward against the spoke, and the iron tire presses inward against the felloe, and the result is a balance of forces that will hold fast against any load the wagon may carry. Thomas stops the tapping briefly and crouches down to examine the tire at eye level. He looks along the edge of the iron, sighting down the circumference the way a carpenter sights along a board to check for straightness. The dark metal is now sitting perfectly flat against the felloe band, with no visible gaps and no places where the tire is tilted. He runs his thumb along the junction between iron and wood, feeling the smooth transition, and he nods to himself. Then he stands, rolls his neck once to loosen it, and takes up his hammer again. There are still a few spots that need attention, places where the tire could seat just a fraction deeper, and he indicates these to John with a pointing finger before they resume the rhythm. The two men work around the wheel once more, this time with lighter taps, almost caresses of the hammerheads against the cooling iron. The sound has changed again, higher and shorter now, more of a tink than a thud, because the tire has cooled enough that the iron has become hard and unyielding. At this stage, the hammer blows are not moving the metal at all. They are simply confirming that the tire is fully seated and that no further adjustment is needed. Thomas strikes the tire at 12 points around the circumference, one for each of the imaginary hours on a clock face, and John mirrors him from the other side. Each tap is answered by a clean, ringing note that tells them the tire is solid and true. At last, Thomas stands his hammer on its head beside him and rests both hands on the end of the shaft. He looks across the wheel at John, and the farmer meets his eyes and gives a small, barely perceptible nod. The work is done. John lifts his own hammer and carries it back to the wall, leaning it carefully beside the others, and then he rolls his shoulders and wipes his brow with the sleeve of his coat. Ned brings the water ladle, offering it first to Thomas and then to John, and both men drink in long, slow swallows before handing it back. The water is cool and clean, and it washes the taste of hot iron and charcoal from their mouths. The wheel stands on the flagstone, its new tire now a uniform, dark grey that is almost black in the shadows, and slightly lighter where the sun touches it. The surface of the iron is rough with scale, and marked here and there with the faint circular impressions of the hammer blows, tiny dimples that will wear smooth after the first few miles on a gravel road. The oak felloes beneath the tire are charred to a thin dark ring that peeks out just at the edge of the iron, a sign that the bond between metal and wood is complete. The wheel is ready. It will need no further work beyond greasing the hub and fitting it to its axle, and it will roll for years, for decades, carrying its loads of hay and stone and timber over roads rough and smooth. John takes his leave, with the same quietness with which he arrived. He picks up his hammer, gives Thomas a nod, and Ned a brief clasp of the shoulder, and walks out into the sunny lane. His boots crunch on the gravel, and then the sound fades as he turns toward his own farm, where there will be other work waiting. Thomas watches him go for a moment, then turns back to the wheel. He places his palm flat against the tire, feeling the residual warmth that still clings to the iron, a warmth that will take hours more to fully dissipate into the autumn air. It is a pleasant warmth, alive with the memory of the fire, and he holds his hand there for a long, quiet moment before finally letting it drop. The smithy settles back into stillness. Ned picks up the mallet and the tongs and returns them to their places on the wall, and Thomas takes a rag and wipes down the flagstone where the quenching water has left a dark, damp ring. The forge fire crackles softly to itself, its bed of coal still glowing a deep, sleepy red under the layer of ash that has begun to form. The sun has moved a little farther across the floor, and the rectangle of light now touches the edge of the anvil, making the old steel gleam with a dull, silver sheen. The wheel, with its new tire firmly in place, is rolled gently to the side of the workshop, where it will wait until the farmer returns with his cart to collect it. It leans there against the wall, patient and strong, and the smithy door remains open to the quiet village and the murmuring brook and the slow, peaceful turning of an autumn afternoon. The sledgehammers have fallen silent, and the wheel stands in its circle of drying water on the flagstone, with its new tire seated true and firm. But the work of the day is not yet complete, for the tire still holds a deep, lingering heat that must be drawn out slowly and with care. The iron, which was pale and luminous when it first came from the forge and then sank through the oranges and reds as the hammers tapped it home, now rests at a color that is no longer bright, but is still far from cold. A dark, smouldering crimson that you can see only when the sunlight does not fall directly upon the metal. If you were to place your hand near the tire, not touching it, but held a few inches away, you would feel the warmth radiating outward, like the breath of a sleeping animal, steady and deep. Thomas knows that this warmth cannot be allowed to flee on its own without guidance, because iron that cools too quickly in some places and too slowly in others can develop hidden weaknesses, tiny cracks along the grain that would not show themselves until the wheel struck a stone on a rutted road and shattered. The final cooling must be a controlled, patient process, a slow descent from the high heat of the forge to the cool temperature of the autumn air, and it will be managed with water and with watching and with the quiet patience that has guided every step of this day. The bucket of clean water still stands beside the flagstone where Ned placed it before the sledgehammer work began. The water inside is cool and dark, its surface perfectly still, now that the vibrations of the hammers have faded, and it reflects the rafters above in a wavering, upside-down image that trembles when a draft moves through the smithy. A second bucket has been brought over, this one filled from the barrel by Ned, while Thomas and John were tapping the tire into its seat, and it waits beside the first, ready to supply the ladle when the first bucket runs low. The ladle itself is a simple thing, a bowl of hammered iron with a long wooden handle, and it rests across the rim of the nearer bucket with its handle sticking up at an angle. It has poured water over many hot tires in its years of service, and its bowl is stained with the dark bluish marks that come from repeated contact with hot metal and steam. Thomas picks up the ladle with his right hand and dips it into the bucket, filling it to just below the brim. He holds it for a moment, feeling the coolness of the water through the wooden handle, and then he steps toward the wheel with the slow, deliberate tread of a man who understands that the final stages of any work are as important as the first. The tire glows faintly in the dimmer parts of its surface, the deepest reds hiding in the crevices where the hammer blows left their tiny dimples, and the heat that rises from it makes the air shimmer in a thin, transparent curtain. Thomas stops at the edge of the flagstone and looks at the tire as a whole, choosing the place where he will begin, and then he tilts the ladle slowly forward so that a thin stream of water falls onto the iron. The water strikes the hot metal and vanishes instantly into a great billowing cloud of steam that hisses upward with a sound like a sudden exhalation. The steam is thick and white, as dense as the mist that lay over the village at dawn, and it rolls outward from the point of contact in a soft, expanding plume that wraps around the spokes and drifts toward the open door. The tire at the point where the water touched it transforms in a heartbeat, the faint red glow blinking out and being replaced by a deep blue-black color that spreads outward a little way before stopping, leaving a dark patch on the surface of the iron. The hiss of the steam is the loudest sound in the smithy, for that brief moment, and then it fades, and the steam drifts upward into the rafters, where it gathers in a thin, pale layer, before slowly thinning into nothing. Thomas watches the patch of cooled iron carefully. He is looking for any sign that the cooling is happening too fast, which would show itself as a sudden change in the sound of the metal, a sharp, snapping noise instead of the softer hiss of even contraction. He hears no such sound, only the gentle creak of the tire as it shrinks a tiny bit more around the fellow band, Addy nods to himself and dips the ladle again. This time he pours the water a little farther along the circumference, adjacent to the first patch, but not overlapping it entirely, so that the cooling advances in a slow, orderly progression around the wheel. The same sequence repeats: the water, the hiss, the cloud, the darkening, the quiet. The steam from this second pour mingles with the remnants of the first, and the smithy begins to fill with a warm, damp haze that softens all the edges of the tools and the walls, and makes the sunlight slanting through the door look solid, like a golden plank laid across the air. Step by slow step, Thomas works his way around the wheel. He pours a ladle of water, waits for the hiss to stop and the steam to thin, then turns the wheel himself by nudging it with his free hand, bringing a fresh section of the tire into position. The wheel moves easily on the flagstone, its weight balanced on the iron tire that now grips the wood so firmly that the whole assembly rolls as a single piece. After each pour, Thomas pauses and listens, his head tilted slightly to one side, his eyes half closed. The sounds that come from the cooling wheel are many and subtle: the low groaning creak of the oak as it is compressed further by the shrinking iron, the tiny pinging notes of the metal itself as the heat leaves it, the soft crackle of the remaining moisture boiling off the surface. These are all good sounds, the normal music of a proper shrink fit, and they tell Thomas that the work is going exactly as it should. Ned stands nearby, ready to hand Thomas a fresh ladle of water or to turn the wheel if asked, but for now he simply watches and learns. He sees how Thomas does not hurry, how each ladle of water is poured with the same care and at the same slow pace, how the master wheelwright pays attention to the color of the iron and the sound of the steam and the feel of the warmth on his face. The apprentice will remember this when he stands at his own flagstone someday, and he will copy the same unhurried rhythm because he has seen that it produces a tire that holds true. The knowledge passes between them without words, in the space of a quiet smithy on an autumn afternoon, carried by the sight of water meeting hot iron, and the smell of steam, and the patience that fills the room like the warmth from the forge. The color of the tire continues to change as the water does its work. The dark blue-black patches where the ladle has touched now cover most of the circumference, and between them the iron has faded from its smouldering red to a dull dark grey with no glow at all. The transition is gradual, a spectrum that moves from the cool greys at the leading edge of Thomas's progress to the warmer, darker tones that still wait for water. The steam has become thinner now, less of a billowing cloud and more of a steady, quiet wisp that rises from each pour and immediately drifts toward the door. The smell of the smithy has settled into a comfortable blend of wet iron, damp stone, and the faint, lingering sweetness of the charred oak. A smell that is not unpleasant, but rather grounding. The scent of work well done. When Thomas has made his way around the full circle of the tire and returned to the point where he began, he stops and lowers the ladle. The tire is now entirely dark, a uniform matte grey that is almost black in the shadows, and the hissing has stopped. But the work of cooling is not finished, because the tire is still warm to the touch, and the iron deep inside the thickest parts of the hoop will still hold heat that has not yet been drawn out. If Thomas were to leave the wheel now, that trapped heat would slowly escape over the next hour, but it might escape unevenly, and the unevenness could introduce a slight warp. To prevent this, he begins the quenching again, this time with a lighter hand, pouring only half a ladle at a time and letting the water spread more thinly across the surface. This second pass is not about shrinking the tire further, but about bringing the entire mass of the iron down to a uniform temperature so that every part of the hoop cools together in harmony. The second pass is quieter than the first, the steam is thinner and rises more slowly, and the hiss of the water is a soft, sighing sound rather than the sharp, rushing noise of the initial quench. The iron no longer changes color dramatically. It simply darkens a shade or two wherever the water touches it, and then it lightens again as the thin film of moisture evaporates in the gentle heat. Thomas works with the same steady rhythm, pouring and pausing, turning the wheel, pouring again, and the minutes slip past without notice. The sun has moved enough that the rectangle of light on the floor has shifted away from the flagstone and now touches the base of the workbench, illuminating the grain of the old oak and the dark spots where oil has dripped over the years. The brook outside continues its endless murmur, and somewhere in the village a child laughs briefly, the sound bright and distant before it fades. At last, Thomas sets the ladle down on the rim of the bucket and stands back from the wheel. He places his palm flat against the tire, not just near it this time, but actually touching it, and he holds it there. The iron is warm, about the temperature of a sun-warmed stone, but it is no longer hot enough to burn or even to cause discomfort. He moves his hand slowly around the circumference, feeling for any hot spots that would indicate a place where the heat is still trapped, but he finds none. The tire is uniformly warm, cooling together as a single piece, and it will continue to cool slowly over the next hours until it reaches the temperature of the air. By evening, it will be cold to the touch, and its grip on the fellow band will be locked in place. A hold that will not loosen until the wheel itself has worn out and the tire must be cut off and replaced many years from now. Ned comes over and touches the tire himself, his younger hand feeling the same warmth that Thomas felt. He looks up at the master wheelwright, and there is a quiet satisfaction in his face, the look of a young man who has been part of something solid and real. Thomas meets his eye and gives a single, shallow nod, and then he turns away to hang the ladle on its hook near the water barrel. The two buckets are lifted and carried to the door, where the remaining water is tossed out onto the packed earth of the yard, spreading in a dark, quickly drying stain that the sun will erase before the afternoon is over. The buckets are returned to their places, and the smithy begins to settle into the slower pace of the later day. The wheel stands alone on the flagstone, its new tire a dark ring of wrought iron, tight and immovable. The stone around it is damp and dark from the quenching, and a few stray drops of water still cling to the iron in tiny beads that catch the light. The steam has fully dissipated now, leaving the air clear and warm, and the rafters above are dry again, their dark, sooted surfaces unchanged by all the vapor that passed through them. The smell of the quenching lingers a while longer, a faint metallic tang at the back of the throat, but even that will fade as the afternoon air moves through the open door. The forge fire is a bed of deep, red coals now, no longer roaring but still alive, and it will be kept that way until evening, when it will be banked with ash for the night. Thomas finds his rag and wipes his hands slowly, cleaning the last traces of scale and water from his fingers. He walks to the open door and stands there, looking out at the lane and the brook and the fields beyond, his hands resting on his hips. The mist that began the day is only a memory now, replaced by a clear, pale blue sky and a sun that has begun its slow descent toward the western hills. The air is cool but not cold, and it carries the smells of autumn, dry leaves, damp earth, a hint of wood smoke from a distant chimney. He takes a long, quiet breath, letting it fill his lungs, and then he lets it out just as slowly. Behind him, the smithy is quiet, the tools resting, the wheel waiting, the tire cooling degree by gradual degree. The day is not over, but its hardest work is done, and what remains is only the gentle finishing, the final touches that will send the wheel out into the world, strong and true. The tire has cooled enough now that Thomas can lay his whole palm across its surface and feel only a mild, comfortable warmth, like a stone that has sat in the autumn sun for an hour. The deep, gripping cold that will come with evening has not yet arrived, but the fierce heat of the forge is only a memory in the iron, and the wheel is ready for its final inspection and its last small touches before it rolls out of the smithy and back to its wagon. Thomas and Ned lift the wheel from the flagstone together, each taking hold of the rim on opposite sides, and they carry it with the same careful coordination they have used all day. The wheel is heavy, made heavier still by the new tire, but their movements are practiced and easy, and they set it gently onto a wooden stand that Thomas has placed near the workbench, where the light from the open door falls bright and clear. The stand is a simple construction of two upright posts with a horizontal iron pin between them, and it holds the wheel at chest height so that every part of it can be seen without stooping or craning. Thomas steps back and looks at the wheel as a whole, taking in its shape and its balance. The new tire is a dark, even ring around the fellow band, its surface rough with the scale that will soon wear smooth on the roads, and the oak spokes radiate from the hub in their pattern of 8, each one straight and solid. He gives the wheel a gentle spin with one hand, a light push at the rim that sets it turning on the iron pin, and he watches the rotation with his head tilted slightly to one side. The wheel turns silently at first, Then, with a soft whispering sound as the hub settles into its spin, and Thomas fixes his eyes on the rim where the tire meets the wood. He is looking for any wobble, any side-to-side movement that would mean the tire has not seated true, or the spokes have shifted during the heating. A wobble, even a small one, would make the wagon shimmy on a smooth road and shake apart on a rough one, so he watches with the full weight of his experience, his eyes tracking the dart line of the tire as it goes round and round. The wheel spins true. The tire describes a perfect circle in the air, with no waver and no tilt, and the spokes pass before his eyes in a steady, unbroken rhythm. He lets it spin until the motion slows to a stop, and then he spins it again in the opposite direction, watching just as closely. Again, the tire holds its line, and the only movement is the rotation itself, smooth and balanced. A wheel that spins true at this stage will spin true for years, because the forces that hold it together are now locked in place by the shrunken iron tire, and nothing short of a catastrophe will change them. Thomas gives a quiet, satisfied grunt and stops the wheel with his hand, patting the rim twice as if in thanks. Next, he reaches for a small wooden wedge that has been sitting on the corner of the workbench since the morning, a thin slip of hard oak that he shaped with a chisel while the fire was catching. The wedge is no longer than his little finger and tapered like a very flat blade, and its purpose is an old one, a custom passed down through generations of wheelwrights. Although the tire is tight and the fellow joints are sound, the wood of the wheel will expand and contract with the seasons, swelling in the damp winters and shrinking in the dry summers. A small gap can open between the tire and the felloe during a long drought, and into that gap a wedge can be driven to keep the tire from shifting. Thomas does not expect the wheel to need this wedge anytime soon, but tradition calls for a wedge to be set, a small insurance against a dry season that might come years from now, and he honors the tradition because it costs little and might someday save a wheel. He finds a place between the tire and the felloe where a very slight irregularity in the wood leaves a hair's breadth of space, a gap so small that it is almost invisible. He inserts the thin end of the wedge into this gap and taps it gently with the heel of his hand, driving it in just far enough that it holds firm. The oak wedge creaks softly as it seats itself, and then it is still. Thomas takes a small sharp knife from his apron pocket and trims the exposed end of the wedge flush with the tire, cutting it cleanly so that nothing protrudes to catch on a stone or a rut. He rubs the spot with his thumb until the surface is smooth, and then the wedge is all but invisible, a hidden guardian against a far-off dry spell that may never come. With the wedge in place, Thomas moves his attention to the hub. The elmwood hub, dark with old grease and polished by the turning of the axle, has two iron bands shrunk around it that hold it together under the pressure of the spokes. These bands are still tight, just as they were this morning, and Thomas sees no need to adjust them. But the square hole through the center, where the axle will fit, needs fresh grease to carry the wheel smoothly and to keep the wood from cracking under friction and load. He takes a lump of tallow from the pot on the workbench, a pale, firm fat rendered from mutton suet, and he works it in his fingers for a moment until it softens just enough to spread. The tallow has a mild, earthy smell, not unpleasant, and it glistens slightly in the sunlight. Thomas presses a generous amount into the axle hole, pushing it into the corners with his thumb, and he coats all four sides of the square opening until the wood is dark and slick. Then he turns the wheel slowly on its pin, letting the tallow work deeper into the fibers, and he adds another small amount where the grease seems to soak in most quickly. The hub will now turn on its axle with a smooth, quiet motion, and the tallow will protect it for many miles before it needs to be renewed. While Thomas works on the hub, Ned has been moving quietly around the smithy, returning the tools to their proper places. He lifts the sledgehammers from where they leaned against the wall and hangs them on their pegs, the long handles clicking softly against the stone. He coils the measuring cord and hangs it on its nail, and he sets the calipers back on their hook near the anvil. The wooden mallet that was used to seat the tire goes back into its corner, and the tongs are wiped clean with a rag and hung with their jaws pointing downward. Each tool has its place, and Ned knows them all, having learned them over 2 years of mornings and afternoons, just like this one. There is a quiet contentment in the putting away of tools, a closing of the chapter that mirrors the opening of the day, when everything was laid out in the misty morning light. The forge fire has been left to burn low throughout the afternoon, and now Thomas goes to it and picks up the long rake. He levels the bed of coals with a few slow strokes, spreading them evenly across the fire bricks so that no hot spots remain, and then he takes up the ash bucket that has been filled with the grey dust from the morning's cleaning. He scatters the ashes over the coals in a thin, even layer, using the rake to spread them gently until the orange glow is entirely covered. The coals will keep their heat through the evening and into the night, banked under their blanket of ash, and in the morning there will still be enough warmth to light a fresh fire with a handful of twigs and a few breaths from the bellows. The smell of the dampened coals is soft and smoky, a smell that speaks of rest and of the slow passage of time. Outside, the farmer John has returned from his morning errand and now stands in the doorway with his cart waiting on the lane. His horse, a patient brown gelding, stands with its head lowered and one hind hoof cocked, dozing in the pale afternoon sun. John steps inside and walks over to the wheel, and he examines it with the eye of a man who has seen many wheels and knows what makes them last. He runs his hand along the tire, feeling its roughness, and he checks the hub with his thumb where the fresh tallow still glistens. Then he looks at Thomas and speaks in the same low, calm voice that has always been his way. "It is a good wheel," he says, and the words carry the weight of a longer conversation. Thomas nods and answers that there is another wheel that will need a new tire before the winter sets in, a rear wheel from the same wagon that has begun to show wear on its iron. John considers this and says he will bring it next week, when the weather still holds, and Thomas agrees that next week will be soon enough. The two men speak quietly for a few more minutes, discussing the state of the roads and the price of iron and the likelihood of an early frost, and their voices blend with the murmur of the brook and the distant sounds of the village. The conversation ends as it began, without ceremony, and John takes hold of the wheel. He tips it off the stand and rolls it through the open door into the yard, where the packed earth is dry and firm under the afternoon sun. The wheel moves easily, its new tire making a light clicking sound as it passes over the small stones and the ridges of the lane. It is a sound that is different from the old tire's dull scrape, a sharper, cleaner note that speaks of fresh iron and a tight fit. Thomas and Ned follow the farmer out into the yard and watch as he lifts the wheel onto the bed of his cart, laying it flat among the straw and the old sacks that will keep it from shifting on the ride home. The wheel settles into the cart with a soft thud, and the gelding pricks its ears forward but does not move. John takes up the reins and clicks his tongue softly, and the cart begins to roll away down the lane. The iron tire of the new wheel clicks against the wooden bed with each small bump, and the sound grows fainter as the cart moves past the well and the elm tree and the baker's cottage, where the smell of fresh bread still drifts from the open window. Thomas stands in the yard and watches until the cart has disappeared around the bend by the brook, and then he turns back to the smithy. The sun is lower in the sky now, and the shadows have grown long across the yard, stretching from the wood pile to the stone wall and from the anvil block to the door. The day is reaching its later hours, and the work that filled it is complete. Inside the smithy, Ned has swept the floor with a broom made of birch twigs, gathering the flakes of iron scale and the bits of charred wood into a small pile near the hearth. He scoops the sweepings into a bucket that will be emptied on the midden behind the workshop, and then he hangs the broom on its nail and stands looking around the quiet room. The smithy is clean and ordered, the tools resting in their places, the forge fire banked and sleeping, the anvil silent on its block. The only sign of the day's work is the dampering on the flagstone, where the quenching water dried, and even that is fading as the stone absorbs the last of the moisture. The air is still and warm, and the open door lets in the golden light of the late afternoon, a light that is softer than it was at noon, and full of the promise of evening. Thomas comes back inside and walks to the bench, where he picks up the slate with its chalk marks and wipes it clean with his rag. The numbers that guided the forging and the fitting are erased now, no longer needed, and the slate hangs again on its nail, ready for the next wheel and the next measurement. He folds his apron over his arm and sets his wool cap on the bench, running his hand through his hair where the cap has pressed it flat. His movements are slow and easy, the movements of a man whose body has worked hard but not beyond its strength, and his face carries the quiet contentment of a day spent in the making of something solid and lasting. The sparrows have returned to the rafters, settling into their nests with soft, chattering chirps that sound like a conversation winding down for the night. The brook outside continues its steady murmur, a sound that has been there all day and will be there all night and will still be there when the next wheel comes to be shod and the next tire comes to be shrunk. The village settles into the gentle rhythm of evening, the smoke from the chimneys rising in straight columns against the pale blue sky, the rooks gathering in the elm tree with their low, throaty calls. The wheel has gone home, the work is done, and the smithy rests in the quiet that comes between the labor of the day and the deep, restoring silence of the night. The sun has moved across the sky in its slow, certain arc, and now it hangs low above the western hills, casting a golden light that is softer and warmer than the bright white of noon. This light falls through the open door of the smithy and touches everything with a gentle amber glow, turning the stone walls to honey and the dark iron tools to bronze. The shadows have grown long and thin, stretching from the legs of the workbench across the packed earth floor and climbing the far wall like quiet, dark vines. Inside the smithy, the air is still and warm, holding the last traces of the day's heat, and the faint, pleasant smells of charcoal, hot iron, and seasoned oak that had been the constant companions of the hours. Thomas stands near the door with his apron now folded over his arm, looking out at the lane and the brook and the fields that slope gently toward the distant woods, and he feels the slow, deep satisfaction of a day that has been filled with good work from its misty beginning to its golden end. The tools that we use today must be cleaned before they are put away, because a tool that is cared for will last a lifetime, and then some, passing from hand to hand through generations of craftsmen who will never know each other's names but will share the same feel of the worn ash handle and the same weight of the iron head. Thomas walks to the bench and picks up the cross-peen hammer first, the one that shaped the glowing iron bar into a curve this morning, and he holds it up to the light. The head is dark with scale and soot, and a few tiny flakes of iron still cling to the peen where it struck the hot metal. He takes an oiled rag from the shelf, a soft cloth that has been soaked in linseed oil and then wrung out until it holds only a thin, protective sheen, and he wipes the hammerhead slowly, working the oil into the steel with small, circular motions. The oil darkens the metal and brings out the faint, silvery gleam beneath the soot, and the smell of the linseed mixes with the older smells of the smithy, clean and nutty. He rubs the handle as well, paying attention to the grip where his hands have worn the wood smooth, and then he sets the hammer in its place on the bench and turns to the next tool. The long tongs are next, 2 pairs of them that we use to lift the glowing tire from the forge and carry it across to the waiting wheel. Their jaws are dark with scale and a little soot, and the pivot joints have a fine dusting of iron flakes that might cause them to stick if not cleaned away. Thomas works the oiled rag over the jaws and the handles, wiping each pair from end to end, and he opens and closes the pivots a few times to work the oil into the joints. The tongs move smoothly now, without any creak or catch, and he hangs them back on their pegs with the jaws pointing downward so that the oil will not run into the pivot and loosen over time. The colipas and the measuring stick are wiped next, though they need little more than a quick pass of the rag, and then the chisel and the wooden mallet and the heavy rake that was used to spread the coals. Each tool receives its moment of attention, and each is returned to its proper place until the bench is clear and the wall racks are full and orderly. Ned has taken up the broom again and is sweeping the corners of the smithy, where the dust and the scale have drifted during the day. His strokes are slow and even, the birch twigs making a soft, rustling sound on the stone floor, and he moves from the back wall near the forge toward the open door. A fine, dark dust rises in a thin cloud and settles again as he works, and he pauses now and then to scoop up a small pile with a flat piece of tin and empty it into the ash bucket. The flagstone where the wheel stood is still damp in a few spots, and he sweeps around it carefully, letting the broom pick up the loose bits without disturbing the moisture that is slowly sinking into the stone. He works his way to the threshold, where the packed earth of the yard meets the stone floor, and then he stops and leans the broom against the wall, looking at the clean, ordered space with a quiet pride that he would never speak aloud. The forge fire, which has been banked for a while now, needs a final tending before the smithy can be closed for the night. Thomas walks to the hearth and looks down at the bed of coals that still glows a deep, sleepy red beneath its blanket of ash. The ash has settled and thickened, and only a few thin streams of smoke rise from the small cracks where the heat finds its way through. He takes the rake and draws the ash more evenly over the coals, covering them completely so that no spark can find the air and burn itself out before morning. Then he takes the small shovel and scoops a little fresh charcoal from the pile near the bellows, scattering it in a thin layer over the ash. This charcoal will sit on top of the banked fire through the night, drying gently, and in the morning it will catch quickly when Thomas blows the fire back to life. The bellows themselves are left in their closed position, the top board resting flat, the leather folds collapsed and still. Thomas pats the wooden handle once, as a rider might pat a horse after a long journey, and then he turns away from the forge. The water barrel by the door is still nearly full, its surface dark and cool, and Thomas dips the ladle one last time for a drink. He swallows slowly, feeling the water wash the dryness from his throat, and then he pours a little into his palm and rubs it over his face and the back of his neck. The water is cold from the well, and it feels good after the long heat of the day. A small, refreshing shock that clears the mind and closes the chapter of the work. Ned comes over and drinks as well, and then they pour the remaining water from the quenching buckets into the barrel, making sure nothing is wasted. The buckets are turned upside down to dry, set against the wall where they will wait for the next tire and the next quenching. Now the smithy is almost ready for the night. Thomas walks around the room one last time, his eyes passing over the anvil on its oak block, the trestles pushed back against the wall, the chalk slate hanging clean on its nail, the hammers and tongs and calipers all in their places. The wheel is gone, delivered back to the farmer and to the wagon that will carry it over many roads, but its absence does not feel like a lack. It feels like the natural conclusion of the day's work, the purpose for which all the tools were laid out this morning and all the coals were burned. The smithy has done what it was meant to do, and now it rests, waiting for the next wheel and the next bar of iron and the next slow, patient day. Outside, the evening is settling over the village with the same gentleness that the mist brought at dawn. The sun has dipped low enough that the sky above the western hills is a wash of pale gold and soft pink, fading to a deeper blue overhead where the first faint stars are beginning to show themselves. The air has cooled enough that you can feel the difference on your skin when you step from the smithy into the yard, a light, fresh coolness that carries the smell of damp earth and dry leaves and the distant promise of the night. The brook continues its murmur, as it has all day and as it will all night, a sound that has become so woven into the fabric of the place that you notice it only when you stop and listen. The rooks have settled into the elm tree for the night, their calls fading into occasional sleepy croaks, and the bats have begun their flickering flights above the meadow, dark shapes against the pale sky. Thomas walks to the woodpile and selects a few split logs that he will carry home for his own hearth. The logs are dry and light, their ends dark with age, and he tucks them under his arm without hurry. Ned has come out of the smithy and is standing by the door, waiting for Thomas to close up. The apprentice lives in a small room above the baker's cottage, and he will walk back along the lane in a few minutes, passing the well and the elm tree and the brook, and he will eat his supper of bread and cheese and cold mutton, while the baker tells him the small news of the day. The two of them will meet again tomorrow, when there will be other work to do, a plough blade that needs sharpening, a hinge that needs straightening, a bolt that needs forging from a scrap of old iron. But that is tomorrow, and tonight there is only the quiet walk home and the rest that waits at the end of it. Thomas pulls the heavy smithy door closed, drawing it slowly on its iron hinges, until it meets the stone frame with a solid, final sound that marks the end of the working day. He checks that the latch has fallen into place, and then he turns and walks across the yard toward the lane, his boots making the same soft, steady crunch on the gravel that they made this morning when the mist was still thick and the day was still only a promise. The wool cap is on his head again, and his leather apron is folded over his arm, and he carries the firewood tucked under the other arm with the ease of long habit. The smithy stands behind him, dark and silent, its great door closed, its tools resting, its forge fire a hidden heart of red beneath the ash. The lane is quiet in the evening light. The thatched roofs of the cottages are dark shapes against the fading sky, and the windows glow with the warm yellow light of candles and hearth fires. A thin column of smoke rises from each chimney, straight at first and then bending where it meets the cooler air above the rooftops. You can smell the wood smoke and the cooking fires, the faint aroma of boiling cabbage and roasting onions that drifts from the cottages and mingles with the clean, cold smell of the coming night. The baker's window is still lit, and you can see his silhouette moving slowly inside as he covers his doughs for the night. The well bucket hangs motionless on its rope, and the single cat, grey and silent, pads across the lane and disappears into the shadows by the brook. Thomas walks past the well and the elm tree and the little stone bridge where the brook runs under the lane, and he turns onto the path that leads to his own cottage. The windows there are lit as well, and he knows that his wife has kept the fire going and set the pot of soup on the hob to warm. The garden gate swings open with a familiar creak, and he closes it behind him and sets the firewood in the small shed by the door. For a moment he stands in his own yard, looking back toward the village and the dark shape of the smithy beyond the hedgerows. The sky has deepened to a dusky blue, and the stars are sharper now, scattered across the heavens like the sparks that flew from the anvil this morning. The air is cool and still, and the brook's murmur is a distant, steady thread of sound that will follow him into sleep. He opens the cottage door and steps inside, and the warmth of the hearth wraps around him like a familiar blanket. His wife looks up from her sewing and smiles, and he hangs his cap on its peg and sets his apron on the stool by the door. The soup is ladled into a bowl, and he sits at the wooden table with the fire crackling beside him, and he eats slowly, savouring the warmth and the quiet and the knowledge that the wheel is finished and the smithy is closed and the night is his to rest in. Outside, the village settles deeper into the evening. The lights in the windows going out one by one, the rooks silent in the elm tree, the brook flowing on under the little stone bridge. The smithy stands dark and patient, its iron and its oak and its tools waiting in the stillness for the next dawn and the next mist and the next wheel that will need a new iron tire. And the wheel that Thomas and Ned and John the farmer shrunk today rolls now on the back of the cart. Its new tire tight and true, its oak felloes bound in iron that will grip for years, for decades, through mud and dust and summer heat and winter cold. It will carry loads of hay from the meadow and stone from the quarry and firewood from the forest, and it will creak and hum on the roads, a sound that anyone who hears it will know as the voice of a wheel well made. The iron remembers the fire that expanded it, and the wood remembers the hammer that seated it, and the two will hold each other fast until the wheel itself has worn away. That is the way of iron and wood, and that is the way of the smithy by the brook, where the mist rises at dawn, and the steam rises at midday, and the evening settles over the village like a slow, quiet blessing.